Welcome. Thanks for watching this dairy video brought to you by DairyXNet. Today, Dr. Albert de Vries joins us to discuss the value of using genomic selection in a dairy reproduction program. Dr. de Vries is currently a professor in the Department of Animal Sciences at the University of Florida. He grew up on a dairy and swine farm in the Netherlands and went on to attend Wageningen University, where he received a BS and MS in animal science, with a minor in agricultural economics. He then came to the U.S. to pursue a PhD in animal sciences at the University of Minnesota, with a focus on dairy science, applied economics, operations research, and statistics. After graduation, Albert accepted a faculty position at the University of Florida in Gainesville. He currently teaches 2 undergraduate dairy courses and advises both undergraduate and graduate students. His research interests are in optimization of culling and replacement strategies, statistical process control, economics of reproduction and genetics, and precision dairy farming. In his extension role, he works with the allied dairy industry and dairy farmers on farm financial management and to apply the results of dairy systems management research.
Well, thank you for the introduction. So my presentation is about ways and circumstances where we can find value in genomic testing. Okay, and as we will see, it sort of depends on the case. Before I get into some analysis here, I want to acknowledge basically the USDA NIFA grant that allows us to do this work. There's a research and extension component. This is part of the extension component, and it's a collaboration between USDA, Washington State University, University of Idaho, University of Missouri, and then the University of Florida. And at the bottom, you see the link to our project site where you find more information on outreach and research results from this grant. So in this presentation, I basically want to do 5 different things. First, walk through some concepts and setting the stage for where does the value of genomic testing come from. And then, as we will see, part of that value comes from selecting calves. And so that begs the question, maybe I should make more dairy heifer calves than I really need, so I have some room for selection. On the other hand, we see more and more lately that producers start to use beef semen to sell crossbred calves. And obviously, if you make crossbred calves, you cannot make dairy heifer calves, so there is to be a trade-off there. I'd like to talk about genomic testing in that scenario as well. Then at the end, say a little bit about cow cull rate, because how high our cow cull rate is does affect these previous decisions about how many heifer calves do I have surplus and perhaps whether I should use beef semen or not. And then wrap up with a summary of this presentation here. So this slide are PTAs for net merit dollars from 2,000 heifers. I've masked the data a little bit, but this is real data. Okay, and so we see here that we had a minimum of $69, that's on the far left, and the highest heifer had a maximum of $970 net merit. The average was $512. And if you look at the spread within that distribution, it is a standard deviation of 145, okay? And so this, what is often then being promoted, if you will, is just go sort of the left hand and see how much the average of the remaining animals goes up here. And these were genomically tested animals. All right, so on the left hand, I just sold X% of heifer calves, and you see in my table here that I either culled nothing, that means I left the all animals there, as we've seen on the previous slide. I want to highlight here when I sell 20% of all these heifers, so that's the left 20%. Okay, then my average net merit PTA goes up from 512 to 564 in the 80% that I keep. And there's a gain of $52 on average, okay? And we can see that the lowest score, the lowest net merit is then a 391. You can also see in the standard deviation, if you go through the column, that the more I select, the higher my cull rate is, the smaller my standard deviation becomes, right? So the variation that's left over after highly selection becomes less and less, and that has some consequences for if I'm going to use my genomic test results later, for example, to identify, say, the best 50% of the heifers that I might select with a genomic test and then breed with sex semen. Okay, so if I do cull a lot of animals out of my calves, then I reduce my standard deviation there. But the average of the ones that I keep does go up here. So this $52 gain in PTA for net merit, how much is that actually worth here? Okay, so the net merit is basically an economic index, and it is expressed in dollars gain compared to a base animal over that lifetime of that animal. And the lifetime is generally 3 years, about. Okay, but remember that a predicted transmitting ability really says something about what the offspring is receiving from mom. So if we have genomically tested heifers and we keep the best ones, and the best ones were $52 PTA better, it means they themselves, this population of the 80% that I keep, are actually $104 better than the average that we started out with. Okay, we need to multiply our predicted transmitting ability by 2 to get to the estimated breeding value to really say something about the genetic expression of the animals themselves that we just tested. And if that is lifetime is per 3 years, and I divide my 104 by 3 years, I get to a $34 increase in estimated breeding value per year. Okay, so in this example, keeping the best 80% of heifers would increase my genetic level of my herd, if I kept doing this over and over again, by $34 per cow per year. Okay, now that's on the genetic side. Not every animal that we keep in this scenario, the 80% that we keep, will actually make it to be a cow and express that genetics. So we have to subtract a little bit for heifers that are culled or died before they calve for the first time. And secondly, pretty much all of the net merit is expressed as a cow. And so if we genomically test animals at a young age, it might take us 3 years before that average increase in genetic value is expressed. So we should do some discounting because financial rewards in the future are less worth today. Okay, this is the basic breeder's equation that we've just basically seen an example of. Okay, where does genetic progress come from? And it comes from 3 sources: genetic variation, selection intensity, and then the reliability of the information. So genetic variation means how much genetic differences are there in the herd that I have, okay? So usually we assume that to be a given. Say there's a certain amount of variation for milk production or also net merit. Selection intensity then is how picky we can be. Our selection intensity goes up with the higher percent we're culling. So if we cull 50%, we have a higher selection intensity than when we cull, say, 10%. Okay, so we make obviously more progress, as the previous table showed, when we sell a lot of the worst animals, because then the average of the ones that we keep increases faster. But also we need some kind of reliability or information on how do we actually select the animals that we keep. Okay, so the higher the reliability is of the information, the better a job we do really ranking animals for the true genetic merits, and the realized genetic progress then is greater than when we have sort of a poor measure of ranking animals. For example, if we had a very low reliability. Okay, so genetic progress in the breeder's equation is from one generation to the next, and we should divide that by the generation interval, or the average age of the parents when the offspring is being born, to calculate the genetic progress per year. And that's probably what we're interested in, given then obviously the cost to make this happen. Yeah, so this is perhaps somewhat not an obvious concept to people, but if you look at research done by Bijma and Calles several years ago, they basically show that the reliability from the parent average is an overestimated reliability when it comes to selecting animals. Okay, and we're interested in, obviously, when we select animals, we rank them for a predicted value, and we hope that is highly correlated with their true genetic value. Okay, and indeed this parent average reliability might be overestimated. In the red, you would see what you could consider traditional reliabilities. Maybe if calves are being born at parent averages and we had very good identification, we're having maybe a 34% reliability. And then if you go to the right, if the animal gets older, the reliability increases somewhat because more data is available on these animals here. But if you follow the adjustment that Bijma and Calles show, and again, this is research, they say, well, you really have to adjust down these traditional reliabilities, and then you get to the yellow, which I'll call equilibrium reliabilities, okay? And these are adjusted basically for selection in the population. All right, in blue, my blue bars are genomic tested reliabilities, and perhaps they should be a little higher, but they are what they are here. And so if we look then at what is the value of genomic testing, a big part of the value comes from an increase in the reliability of ranking animals. And really we should be comparing then the equilibrium parent average reliability, the yellow ones, with the blue ones, the genomic reliabilities. Okay, and so you can see the difference between the blue and the yellow. The middle one is a much bigger jump, much bigger gain in reliability than between the blue, the genomic, and the traditional reliabilities we might have from sire proofs. So that's important to at least include in the math when we calculate the value of genomic testing. In this graph, I did look at the value of genomic testing by just keeping the better animals. At the bottom, we have the percent of animals that we kept or selected. Okay, and I did compare the value or the increase in genetic gain from a genomic test with a reliability of 60% versus already having some reliability, namely the equilibrium reliability, that according to the previous slide should be low, only 6%. So we compare the genomic reliability, the gain we get from that, with having something for free, already 6% for free. And so on the right-hand side, 100%, we're not selecting anything. We keep all animals. I said my test costs here $45. And then we see that obviously we're not making any genetic gain because we're not selecting, but we're spending $45 on every animal, and therefore our net lifetime benefit is a minus $45. Okay, if I go to the left and I say, well, I'm going to keep, say, 80% of my animals, 20% I sell, okay, and I did spend $45 on testing all of them, then my genetic gain is about $70 there. That's the value in green there. The genetic testing cost that now has to be paid for by the 80% of the heifers that I keep. So I test all heifers, 100% of them, but I'm saying only the ones that I keep gain from this testing cost, and the 20% that I sell, in their value there is no gain in that they were ever selected. Okay, so we see if we go to the left, the testing costs go up because fewer and fewer animals, namely fewer animals that are selected, have to pay for testing all heifers, and I assume that all heifers are tested here. We also see with the green that if I go to the left, obviously my genetic gain goes up because my selection intensity is higher. Okay, and so the blue line then is the difference between the green and the red line. And we see that when we select 85% or more, then the genomic testing cost is $45, pays for itself compared to not testing animals. Okay, I've not done any discounting. I just said, okay, the genetic gain is expressed as we see it. So no discounting, no little adjustment for perhaps some heifers that don't make it to a later lactation. Okay, so this is a somewhat simple example. If we go to the left, more animals kept, then we have a higher selection intensity. And so that basically asks the question on real dairies, making the scenario a little bit more realistic, should we make more dairy heifer calves than are needed? Or are we just using what we have, say from conventional breeding, and then do a genomic test on those perhaps and sell the surplus, right? So if I use more sex semen, I would have a higher selection intensity. I would have a greater selection gain, and I might have some other advantages by creating dairy calves. For the dams, for example, I might have less dystocia. There's some evidence that the cows that had dairy calves produce a little bit more milk. So there's some additional benefits that directly come to the dam when she had a dairy calf versus a bull calf or perhaps a crossbred calf. All right, so we need to think in terms of a genetic model here. So on the bottom, I have heifers, parity 1, 2, 3, and 4 and greater. So if you go to the right, then basically the genetic level in the herd goes down. Okay, younger heifers are genetically have a higher genetic merit than older cows here. And if I look at if I did then some selection in my purple here, and I had some surplus, you could see that the genetic level of my herd would go up just by some calf selection that I would have. That's the solid line, trend line compared to the bottom dotted line. I can do more with my genomic test. I can do some selective mating as well. For example, I drew a distribution that's supposed to represent genetic variation within the parity. We could, for example, use the best of the heifers as donors. We could use maybe the next group of heifers we could breed with sex semen. We could put some conventional semen in the mix. We could put some beef semen in the mix. Okay, maybe recipients in the end of it. Well, this whole scenario of using all these different types of inseminations obviously creates a certain amount of dairy calves. And given what my cull rate is, I have a surplus, or I have a great surplus, or I have almost no surplus. That affects my calf selection again, right? So everything sort of ties together here, and genomic testing then fits in this mix as far as calf selection goes. I do a better job there, and I would do a better job with my selective matings here. All right, so genetic progress comes from 4 sources. One is obviously choosing sires, and I will not address that issue here. And then it comes from the age of the dams. Obviously, if we got a lot of heifer calves out of heifers, by virtue of having younger mothers, they are genetically better already. There's a little bit of selective mating within the dams. And then obviously we have genetic progress from selection of calves if we have a surplus. All right, I tried to put everything together here in some big herd budget model. There really is a lot to it. I think all the components that are important, genetics, phenotype, prices, are in there. You will see some of these results. There's going to be a profit per milking cow per year at the bottom. And those are basically before fixed cost. Okay, you might subtract a certain amount of dollars per milking cow, but those are dollars that are unaffected by our mixture here of calf selection, selective breeding, etc. So I have a few of these slides here. Okay, so this is a dairy, and I calibrated it for a 40% cull rate. We're having traditional reliabilities, these equilibrium reliabilities I showed earlier, and we're not working with beef semen at this time. If you look at the first column here, where there's these blue squares in the middle, that means that 100% of the animals were bred with conventional semen. Beef, BE is beef semen, that's the left part. In the middle is conventional semen, on the right is sexed semen. And I would always breed here the genetically best animals with sex semen, the middle with conventional, and the worst with beef. Okay, and then in this model, I can distinguish between heifers 1 is first breedings, heifers 2 is second breedings, heifers 3 is third breedings, heifers 4 plus is fourth and greater breedings. Then there is the blue is for first parity cows, also 4 breedings there. And then the bottom, the green, is for older cows, second and greater, and again 4 types of 4 different levels of breedings that I can do. Okay, and this first scenario there would create 4% surplus dairy calves, all conventional at this fairly high cull rate and reasonable reproductive performance in this herd. And my final profit there would be $465, okay, but that's before some fixed costs perhaps. That's only conventional semen. So if I then went to the right, I said, well, let's put some more sex semen in there because we wanted to make surplus dairy calves. So in the second column there, basically, where it says some sexed, you can see that I bred my first breeding on heifers. All my heifers were bred with sex semen, and then all other animals were bred with conventional semen. And that did create 16% surplus calves. And the difference with my left column is $1 more. Okay, so in this case it's $1 more, so $466 is the second column versus the first column there. And that obviously comes from a little bit of selection of surplus calves. I did sell the surplus calves at the same price as beef, as no beef, but as my bull calves. Then my third column, I used even more sex semen. First 3 breedings, all with sex semen. And even on the cows, the first and 2 breedings, all with sex semen. And I did create 30% surplus calves. Of course, I'm selecting the surplus with a low reliability, only 6% here. And my final profit was actually a loss of $13. That is because my sex semen is a little bit higher in price than my conventional semen. And also because sex semen has a slightly lower conception rate, leads to perhaps a little bit more culling of cows, and cows are a little bit later in milk, a little longer age at first calving as well. So these all make the final profit go down by $13 compared to the left scenario. You'll also see a few optimal mixes. Here I let my computer determine what the optimal mix is in each of those 12 rows of breedings, okay? And so the model found that the majority in the, say in heifers first breeding would be bred with conventional semen, but some with sex semen, okay? And some, if I look at the bars, is maybe 20-25%, and the rest would be with conventional semen. Okay, and if you go down the column there, then because of the low reliabilities, I would still breed some animals with sexed semen there. Okay, and my gain here is only $4 compared to the left column of $465. So there was a little bit of a view of making surplus heifers. Namely, I made 11% surplus heifers here, and that increased my profit by $4 per milking cow per year. Not a lot. I'm going to take this scenario to my next slide here. Okay, and that is my left column there. We had traditional, that was all traditional reliabilities, 40% culling. And the second column is now with genomic reliabilities, okay? And I optimized my breedings again. And so in the left column, we had 11% surplus. If I went to the second column and I now genomically test all my heifer calves, I would actually use more sex semen and I would create 24% surplus of calves, okay? All these calves are going to be genomically tested, and my gain would be $10 per milking cow per year. So from $469 to $479. The right hand is at a much lower cull rates, okay? I have 25% cull rate, traditional reliabilities of 25% genomic reliabilities. And we see that in the traditional case, my profit was $579. If I now use genomic testing on these animals, and genomic testing, I think I put in $35 per test here, I would have a gain of $45 per milking cow per year. And that's mostly because I have a larger surplus of dairy heifer calves to work with that I can use my genomic test results on. And obviously I use them a second time when I do the selective breeding. I determine within the parity and breeding number what % of animals should get conventional or sexed semen there. So here at the bottom end there, we found at least $45 value of genomic testing expressed as a per milking cow per year. Here I'm taking the 25% cull rate scenario from the previous slide, and I wondered, well, how important is that optimal mix that we found? And that is on the left-hand side. Okay, that's $623. And then my second column, I said, well, what if I did genomic testing with only conventional semen? I would actually lose $13 compared to the first column. If I use some sex semen, I would have a loss of 6. And if I use a lot of sex semen, I would have a loss of 5 in this scenario. So although it's interesting to find an optimal breeding mix as far as how much sex semen, how much conventional semen, and how much do I distinguish within each breeding and which parity, if I use some much simpler scenarios, the 3 on the right, I don't sacrifice a lot of gain, and I might gain some by keeping my scenario quite a bit simpler. So quite a few producers are interested in beef semen to sell crossbred calves. All right, we would sell these crossbred calves at a premium. We would maybe use beef semen on low genetic dams. But if we do that, we would create fewer surplus dairy heifer calves. And so that reduces the selection intensity of dairy heifer calves. So I was wondering, you know, what is sort of the balance between and using crossbred calves and giving up some selection pressure on creating dairy calves here. So now I have a 35% cow cull rate. Okay, and I have user-defined scenarios. Actually, the first column is an optimal scenario. So I sort of summarized the amount of breedings. Again, we have beef, conventional and sexed, and we see that there's a little bit of sex semen in all parities. This is traditional reliabilities, and I did not allow beef, and these were optimized, okay? And I did find 16% surplus, getting to a profit of $505 there. Now, if I implemented a user-defined scenario, okay, and my goal was here to make only 5% surplus calves. That was my goal. I said all heifers with sex semen, all cows with conventional, and then older cows, all beef, but I had to use a little bit conventional semen in order to make enough surplus calves in order to be able to replace my 35% cow cull rate there. And there was no value for, no premium on my crossbred calves compared to using conventional semen. And I still would use, I mean, this is all user defined, I still get out to $505. So by adding some beef in the mix in a user defined scenario, I actually found sort of by accident the same profit as in the optimal scenario where I did not allow beef. And mostly this is because my heifer calves now obviously come from the younger dams. And I'm taking some of these heifer calves from these older genetically not so good dams away from my pool here. Then if I increase my crossbred premium to $100 or $200, that's the second and the third scenario. And again, I kept my surplus at 5%. Same scenario as the second column. Obviously, you will see the increase in profit per milking cow per year here. Okay, I wanted to take this scenario to the next one. And that is my left scenario there, user defined, and again, crossbred calves plus $100. If I then go to the right scenario and I optimize my scenario and I still have a premium of $100, I do find that my surplus dairy calves come from 5 to 11%, and I do find the use of beef semen. And so this is an interesting scenario. There's no genomic testing in here, but I do create some surplus of heifer calves, so I can do some selection among those. And I do create some crossbred calves here. It's a little bit of both. If I keep this $100 premium of crossbred calves over dairy bull calves, and I do a genomic test, that's the third column, then because I have this option of genomic or of selling crossbred calves, I'm not making any extra calves here. Because the value is mostly in my beef calves, but I did decide here genomically test all my calves, and the end result is that my profit drops to $538 there. And in the right hand column, I set my premium for crossbred calves back to 0 and let the model optimize its decisions. And again, no beef was being selected, as you might expect, but it did make quite a bit of surplus there of crossbred of dairy calves, 32%. So I think these are just some scenarios out of the many I could have shown, but the option of having premiums for crossbred cattle seems to reduce, the value of genomic testing, because I would just make a lot of crossbred calves and not so much surplus animals anymore. Right, so the few scenarios I've shown and many others I've not shown, I find the value of genomic testing to not paying for itself to at least $50 per milking cow per year. I had at least $45 in what I've shown here. And it really depends on many inputs. Low cull rates, higher reproductive performance in the herd, and especially a lot of genetic variation makes paying for genomic testing easier than when that's not absent. And then there's some other decisions made with genomic testing that are not in the math here, such as correcting misidentification, etc. I've sort of taken care of that by reducing or putting in the cost of genomic testing at $35 here. One thing we haven't really talked much about at all is like, what should that cow cull rate be? I did play with 3 kinds of cull rates, but genetic progress, as we see, increases in bulls, and that might affect culling some. And then a few things about, what should that optimal cull rate actually be? And we've seen from USDA data that genetic progress in bulls is increasing compared to, say, 10 years ago. Okay, the top line are AI bulls, the red are their daughters, and we see the difference, the genetic lag is growing. Okay, bulls are getting better much faster in the past. Eventually the cow line will be parallel again, I believe, to the bull line. But we see an increased genetic lag, okay? Older cows are genetically a lot more disadvantaged today than they used to be in the past. Well, economic theory would say replace sooner if the challenger, that is the new heifer, is technically better than the current asset. So that would argue for higher cull rates. But there's a slide from Zoetis that shows another piece of the puzzle, that older cows make more milk than first lactation cows. So if I had a high cull rate, because I want to bring in all this genetic in my heifers, I would give up cows becoming mature cows and not producing to their potential. All right, so obviously if I had a lower cull rate, that would I would have a lower replacement cost. My milk yield might go up because I have more mature cows, but I also sacrifice a little bit because I don't bring in the highest genetics. And I try to add these 3 things in this curve here. At the bottom line is my genetic opportunity cost. It's basically working with genetically older cows. That's the red. And then if we go from 1 to 10, that is the number of years these animals are in the herd. Okay, so if animals stay longer in the herd, say 6, 7 years, my genetic opportunity cost increases because I hang on to genetically animals that can't quite compete anymore with the latest genetics. On the other hand, the yellow would indicate that my herd replacement costs go down. Thus, I have to replace an animal not as often, and I have a certain, say, $1,700 cost of raising a heifer, and I sell this cow for maybe $800, so there's a loss there. And then in green is an estimate for the lack of maturity. So that number is higher because is positive because when I have first and second lactation animals. And so if I look at the left part of this graph, I have more green because in my herd I have more first and second lactation animals, and they're not mature, and so they gave up some milk production there. So it's a maybe a simple example, but I think it illustrates the balance between those three costs. You would look then for the lowest total cost, and in this simple example, that would be 4 lactations. Okay. I did review the literature some and said, well, now the genetic progress in bulls is going faster than 15 years ago. What would that mean for cull rates? And the consensus seems to be that it might increase culling by a few percent at most, that by itself. But it does not answer what should the cow cull rate by itself be. Okay, but the effect is relatively minor. So let me get to my summary here. I tried to address several topics associated with the value of genomic testing. And we've seen that genomic testing can be profitable, and not always. All right, it comes from culling or selling surplus heifers. That comes a little bit from selective breeding, sex semen, beef semen, embryos, although I haven't talked about embryos here. And there's some value that I haven't really addressed here, like avoiding inbreeding, avoiding recessive matings, and so on. And in the end, no matter how much I look at it, it's a complicated puzzle. In some scenarios it pays and sometimes it doesn't. And especially if you add beef to the mix, it becomes even more complicated. I think we really need some farm-specific recommendations. So no set of recommendations works for everybody. And secondly, I'm still looking for a systematic analysis to find sort of the most important factors to really give some rules of thumb for when does genomic testing pay and pays a lot, and in which scenarios does it clearly not. So with that, that concludes my seminar here, and I thank you for your attention.